Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Rafael Rosengarten, CEO and co-founder of Genialis, the RNA biomarker company. Genialis is reimagining biomarkers for every target, drug, and patient using a combination of precision oncology, RNA, and AI. Before founding Genialis, Rafael spent nearly 20 years in biomedical research, publishing extensively on evolution, immunology, bioengineering, and genetics. He is also a board member and co-founder of the Alliance for AI in Healthcare, a global nonprofit championing the responsible integration of AI in medicine. Beyond his industry achievements, Rafael has an extensive academic background. He graduated from Dartmouth and earned his doctorate from Yale as an NSF Graduate Research Fellow. His postdoctoral training in synthetic biology was conducted under Jay Kiesling at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where he co-invented the J5 DNA assembly tool, now commercialized by Tecellogen Biotechnology. Rafael then furthered his expertise through a National Library of Medicine fellowship in biomedical informatics at Baylor College of Medicine. Over the next 4 episodes, we'll follow Rafael's journey from growing up in rural South Carolina to co-founding Genialis. From his love of science and nature to pivotal roles in synthetic biology and machine learning, Rafael shares lessons in resilience, culture, and making an impact in healthcare. Today, we'll explore Rafael's upbringing, the intellectual influences that shaped him, and the early experiences that sparked his love of science. From snorkeling in salt marshes to studying at Dartmouth, Rafael's story highlights the importance of curiosity and embracing life's twists and turns. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Rafael, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me, John. It's a pleasure.
Before every conversation, we like to start the journey in its earliest days. I think a lot of one's upbringing we can see through lines through one's career and kind of academic and scientific journey. So for the audience out there, could we go all the way back to your upbringing? What was your upbringing like? How did it influence your business philosophy? And how did you get into science?
I grew up in a salt marsh in South Carolina. So I grew up way out in the boonies in rural South Carolina, about halfway between Charleston and Myrtle Beach on the coast. My parents had been, intellectual hippie activists in the 70s and left the Northeast. They met in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They left the Northeast looking for essentially a fight, looking for a place they could continue to make a difference, right? The Vietnam War had ended, and they found this little pocket of the world where the civil rights movement hadn't changed things enough. And so they went to kind of build schools and build community in the Deep South. And so I was born there and I was raised there, a product of public schools in McClellanville, South Carolina. I ended up going to high school in Charleston. So, needless to say, it was maybe a different upbringing than some of your guests. It was full of books, it was full of boats and fishing and raising a lot of the stuff that we ate. So kind of, I like to joke, I call my parents' house Swiss Family Rosengarten. And they still live in this house that they raised me in out in the Marsh. So my love for science just kind of came about because we lived out in nature, right? Like we just had, an unfettered access to beautiful woods and marshes. And that's where we ran around and played all the time. My scientific mentor, though, from a very young age was my uncle. This is my mother's brother-in-law, was a French cell biologist. And, he had a PhD in whatever it was and a postdoc in biochemistry from Berkeley and was running a research lab on the Côte d'Azur on the French Riviera. And we went over there when I was 7 and spent the summer, and he taught me how to snorkel from the jetties off of his laboratory. And we went back when I was 10. And he was kind of a biologist of the old school of what I actually think is not a breed of scientist that exists anymore, where you could study natural history and choose your model organism based on kind of amazing just so stories. So, he was a fertilization expert, and the key model systems to study fertilization were things like sea urchins, because they have giant clear egg cells. The oocytes are great for live microscopy of what happens when sperm enters egg. You can also get lots of sperm and egg, again, just off the docks of your marine laboratory and run these experiments. So he ran this lab and taught me to snorkel, and I knew that that's just kind of what I wanted to do. So I fell in love with science in the process from a very young age. And throughout school, elementary school, middle school, high school, was very strong in various kinds of science and math, but it wasn't obvious what version of that I would choose until much, much later.
Very cool. And I would imagine as like a young adolescent, like when you can combine science and snorkeling.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I was completely enamored by the underwater world. Now, the part of your question was how did that influence my life as a business person or entrepreneur? This is kind of the funny bit, though. I mean, my parents were academics, but kind of like, throwback, I want to say communist, but like socialist hippie types with no business sense whatsoever. Like money was a dirty word in the house. And so I had no business mentorship as a young person. In fact, I would say that until I kind of got through college and got over some of my early idealism, I also sort of espoused this notion of, well, I'm going to do science for the purity of science, right? Like that was my entire motivation. Um, as we'll probably get to with some later parts of the story of how I came about, joining and founding Genialis, I consider myself a rather accidental entrepreneur. Like I didn't set out to be a business person for sure.
I was gonna say that was the same experience for me growing up in Berkeley.
Hmm.
It was like before Burning Man was cool. Like a lot of like my childhood friends, like family
Right.
every year would go to Burning Man and it was like a whole thing. Um,
Hmm.
and I think for me too, the kind of original idea was to do science purely for science.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know, like I think exactly around like the university, you know, Berkeley is a big place and it also has a business school and whatnot. So it kind of like
Right.
via exposure, but absolutely I can empathize with that upbringing, especially coming from the kind of the Bay Area where that and obviously Berkeley with its history and everything.
Yeah.
So when as you were starting to get it sounds like you had this kind of like initial spark for science.
Hmm.
When you were starting to consider going to undergraduate and university, what was going through your mind at that point in time? Where were you looking? Kind of take us back to
Right.
that mindset.
Yeah. So again, I grew up in coastal South Carolina in this poor, predominantly African American school district. Um, I went to a magnet high school in Charleston, so I had a little bit more exposure and a rather good high school education. Um, I wanted to learn how to ski. That was my number one
Yeah.
criteria. And I figured, well, I could go north or I could go west. And this, I had family in the Northeast, and it felt far away, but not too far away, right? So I looked at Dartmouth and Amherst and Williams, and I went and checked out all three, and I applied early to Dartmouth. It owns its own ski mountain, and I
Oh, I
got
didn't
in,
even
and I
know
went,
that.
and yeah, and it was honestly, it wasn't quite that simple, but it was mostly that simple. I had grown up in the marsh, and I wanted to spend time in the mountains, and that was about the whole calculus. Um, so yeah, it also happened to have a very strong, science departments. At the time I thought I wanted to be a chemist. Um, there were some great chemistry professors that I thought I'd work with there. As it turns out, I took exactly one chemistry class and then changed focus.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but what actually sold me on Dartmouth more than the other two schools, which would have been fine, I'm sure, but made me sure of my decision. I went on what do they call it as a pre-frosh trip or whatever, right? Before you get in, when you're checking it out, I went and spent a couple nights on campus, and I went to a slideshow put on by a few of the undergrads who had organized a summer trip for themselves, driving cross country and rock climbing out west. Now, at the time, I had
Right.
never rock climbed before. I went on to have that as a really major hobby of mine
Cool.
through like my 30s, but I didn't get into it until much later. I didn't even climb at Dartmouth. But these kids, they were 19, 20 years old, and they had planned and executed this entire rock climbing road trip. It was like, it was Jack Kerouac, but, instead of on the road, on the rocks. And I was so taken by sort of the can-do attitude, by the growth mindset, by the fearlessness of these kids to go out and do something like that. It's like, these are the kinds of people I want to surround myself with. And again, I didn't start climbing until I was in my late 20s, or mid 20s at any rate. But that was a really seminal experience, just seeing like, hey, if you're kind of fearless, if you believe you can do something, um, the whole world's out there for you.
That's really cool. The overlap is kind of crazy because I still rock climb. Nowadays it's like indoor.
Sure.
out.
Yeah,
I get
you're busy.
shredded. Yeah, I get like I was like I remember going outdoors and just getting absolutely shredded, and I'm like,
Yeah.
and I don't know if I can like do massive pitches, but
Hmm.
definitely like I'm like okay, I can't let this kind of atrophy. Like
Right.
I got to keep this going. So definitely now I'm like indoor climbing. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm a poser or not, but whatever.
Listen, if
But
you're having fun and getting exercise, it's all that matters, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
That's awesome to hear too. And I guess like as you're talking about how your family, your parents were academics in a different way.
Mhm.
And what did you say it was your uncle who
Well, yeah, my uncle is a cell biologist. My parents were both historians. So,
did they ever kind of like nudge you to follow a specific academic pursuit?
nah, never. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, they were just super supportive, and again, it was a very literate household, right? They both
Yep.
had good educations, but also very low pressure. So you know, there were kind of no rules, no regulations. They had pretty
Yep.
flexible careers, so it's like I don't remember having bedtimes. I don't remember having punishments or consequences. The fact that my brother and I both turned out as fairly like disciplined, law-abiding individuals just goes to show there's any number of ways to raise kids.
Yeah.
Um, but no, there was never any academic pressure of that kind. We just, both my brother and I were motivated to do well, and we were curious, but no, it was this love of just absolute love of the natural world, like just wanting to ask questions and figure out how I could go about finding the answers to those questions that drove me into science.
And I think something about that is I think one, it makes sense that you're an entrepreneur,
Hmm.
and it's just like that kind of like curiosity.
Hmm.
Like that's kind of I've always kind of as I'm like seeing kind of like common denominators with other
Hmm.
entrepreneurs is like that like curiosity, and it tends to be when you're kind of just like able to explore, it kind of like fosters that.
Yeah.
Seems to be a trait that I see recurring, that's for sure. And now you're at Dartmouth, and you mentioned took a chemistry class. You're like, nope, this is not for me. When was it that you decided to actually declare your major in undergraduate?
So we weren't required to. In fact, we weren't even expected to until our second year. So I think the idea was try a bunch of stuff your first year. Some of the things I tried, I walked on to the JV soccer team. So, I sat the bench the whole season, but I had a blast and I got to train with the varsity, and some of those guys went on to the MLS. And so that was a
Oh
that
wow.
was a that was fantastic. And not me, like I'm
Yeah.
sitting far left bench on the JV team, but
Yeah.
I got to at least work out and share a locker room with some guys who were a lot better than me. So that was a hoot. And I pledged a fraternity, which was a questionable decision, but ended up being great. And I made some of the best friends of my life through fraternity. My company, Genialis, my corporate lawyer is actually the president of the fraternity. He works at
Oh
a big
wow.
firm in Boston. Yeah, so a lot of us are actually doing interesting things in the world of entrepreneurship now. But this is just a long way to say that academics were not my top priority. They probably weren't my third or even fifth priority my freshman year in college. And chemistry was hard and math was hard. And it's not to say that evolutionary biology, which is where I landed, wasn't hard, but it was a different kind of hard. It spoke to that natural historian in me. The labs were, rather than being in a smelly dark room, was literally, it was
I
like
was
go, it was
that
walk
was my
it was
experience.
walk around the forests of New Hampshire and like learn the taxonomy of the organisms, or figure out how you can do physiological ecology experiments or community ecology experiments. But it suited my kind of mindset, and I would say I was one of the things that I describe myself as a dilettante. And it kind of struck me as again, this old school science that my uncle had demonstrated to me was really exciting. But one of the other things I picked up in college was well, I had always loved cooking. I learned to love to cook for my dad, actually. Just growing up with him, pulling on his apron strings, we'd go fishing, and then he'd teach me how to cook what we caught, that sort of thing. My uncle, the cell biologist, also was a good cook and used to throw these big sort of dinner parties for all the scientists at the marine biological laboratories out in Woods Hole, and I'd get to see that. But I started cooking seriously, like catering in
Oh,
student groups,
sweet.
catering freelance just to have beer money, and then the summer of my junior year of college, I actually came out to Oakland
Oh,
and worked for a family friend who was the chef owner of the Beowulf, which was a
oh,
historic restaurant. It opened the same year as Chez Panisse, was often
oh.
uttered in the same breath as Chez Panisse. He was, if I'm not mistaken and getting this wrong, he was the godfather of Alice Waters' daughter, Fanny Waters.
Oh,
So
wow.
like, so, very
Very
of
cool.
that style, right? So very
Yep.
high end, quintessential Bay Area cuisine. And I spent the summer breaking down artichokes and learning how to butcher ducks and that sort of stuff in the back of the restaurant. And I actually thought this is what I'm going to do with my life, right?
Yeah.
So I was studying evolutionary biology, ecology as a way of like being out in nature. But I had found this other passion, which was cooking. Um, but what the major had going for it, and the reason I kind of like leaned into it, it had a senior study abroad in Costa Rica and Jamaica. And so I got to spend
Nice.
I went to Dartmouth to learn how to ski, and I spent 2 of my 4 winters abroad once I learned how harsh the winter was. And my senior winter I got to spend overseas in Costa Rica,
Cool.
doing tropical ecology, and then in Jamaica doing coral reef ecology. And that part, those 3 weeks at Discovery Bay, was like back to the memories of as a 7-year-old learning how to snorkel. Like this underwater stuff is cool. Like I really wanted to understand how reef communities formed, and especially the little critters. I'm not scuba diver. When you go out on a scuba trip, everyone else is looking for the sharks and the groupers and the big fish, and I've got my nose against the reef looking at the smallest little invertebrates. And so that experience was like, gosh, well, thought I was going to be a this, and then I was going to be a that. No, no, marine biology. That's the ticket, right? So that's kind of how I wound up my college career, is falling back in love with marine biology.
That's so rad. And I was thinking about my lab experience, which was like the polar opposite. It was dingy, smelly, barely any light. Was kind of
Hmm.
like I we were in a basement lab, and there was
Hmm.
like it was in Tolman Hall at Berkeley, which is no longer there because it wasn't earthquake safe. I was in there when it wasn't earthquake safe.
Yeah. Well.
And there was literally a window that was like that big.
Yeah.
And there's just like a little bit of light just beaming in, and you're just like, oh my God.
Hmm.
But I'm very jealous, is I guess what I'm saying here.
I mean, I've done my time in those labs too. I
Yeah.
did, I worked for some chemists in college, but I definitely went for the quality of life over the maybe some of the scientific rigor at times.
Yeah, totally. At Dartmouth, were there any, I guess, professors or mentors that kind of influenced you or took you under their wing, or was this a lot of kind of independent study on your end?
Yeah. So, I mean, there were definitely a lot of professors who were very generous with their time. Um, but I think that, again, I was a little too all over the place to have
Yeah.
anyone be a proper mentor,
Yeah.
because I never stuck with the one thing long enough. So, um, I remember certain professors, Mark McPeak, I had for community ecology. And by then, that was my senior year. I was taking things a lot more seriously, thinking about, do I want to go to grad school? He taught me that mathematics, actually rigorous mathematics, has a very real role to play in evolutionary ecology. In fact, a lot of it is, because so much is based on theory. So I really came to appreciate that. David Peart, and his wife Carol Folt, I worked in her lab for a while. But again, I was really all over the place. At Dartmouth, the people who I think left the bigger impression were my classmates. Um, I mentioned the guys who had done that climbing trip. I had another college classmate who was a couple years ahead of me, but as soon as he left college, he went and started writing guidebooks to national parks. I own
Nice.
a complete collection. He still does them. In fact, a couple weeks from now, by the time this airs, this will be old news. But next weekend, my family's flying out to Zion National Park, for the
Sweet.
holidays, and we're taking his guidebook with us, right? So what does that have to do with anything? Again, it's this sort of can-do attitude of forge your own path kind of attitude that I really admired among my classmates, and saw that kind of over and over again.
That's awesome. And at this period in time, is this when you went over to the Pacific Northwest for Friday Harbor
No,
Lab?
that comes later, actually. That comes a good bit later. So the
Okay.
short the short version is I graduated from Dartmouth, was not a good enough student in my mind to go right to grad school. Like my grades weren't great. Probably wouldn't have done well on the test scores, or the was it is it MCATs? What was it? GSATs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have, or GREs or whatever. I wouldn't have done well on those. I just, I needed some time in a lab. I followed a girlfriend down to Southern Connecticut. She had a hedge fund job. I actually, no, I went home to South Carolina. I worked in a bakery for the summer. And I became a pie dough expert at Kudzu Bakery in Georgetown, South Carolina. Phenomenal
Sweet.
bakery. They have a few franchises around coastal South Carolina today.
Cool.
So, I kept scratching that itch. Then I moved up to Connecticut where my college sweetheart had a hedge fund job, and I got a job at Yale. And so I found one of the few professors, not maybe not in the world, but in the United States, who was doing real molecular genetics on clonal marine invertebrates. So I figured out, all right, I want to keep studying marine beasties, but I didn't love the just kind of ecology, hand wavy theory stuff. I wanted to do actual like molecular biology. I wanted to learn why, like
Yeah.
why does this stuff work, right? This guy, his name was Leo Buss, was a pioneer in this field. He also came from I want to scuba dive for a living. How do I scuba dive for a living sort of,
Yeah.
mentality, but a really, really brilliant thinker. He had won a MacArthur Genius Award at a very young age for some theory and had a lab with an actual forward genetics program breeding hydractinia, these clonal hydroids. And so I went and was his lab tech for 2 years and did that during the week. And then on weekends drove home to suburban Connecticut and worked at a fancy French restaurant Friday and Saturday nights. Right. So like just how do I keep doing all the things, right? My contribution to science at the time is I figured out how to grow in the lab an organism called Trichoplax at herons. It's was at the time the only named species of phylum Placozoa, which is the morphologically simplest animal known to science. And we would have to collect them, and I think they had gotten funding to get the genome sequence. So this is like 2001, 2002, right? The human genome was in draft form. They had a lot of sequencing capacity. They had stood up for the human genome, so you could apply to say, hey, we have another critter we should sequence. And at this time, if you sequence the genome of something, it got on the cover of Nature or Science, like by default. Like every new genome was a cover. And so they had gotten funding through a consortium, through JGI, the Joint Genome Institute, Department of Energy out in California, to sequence the genome of this thing. And so I figured out how to grow it in the lab, and grew enough of it to send tissue out to JGI to get it sequenced. Meanwhile, I was cooking at night and or on the weekends and trying to figure out what to do. Right. I decided to give the cooking thing a real try, so I quit the lab job, went down to New York City, and I printed out 20 resumes. Now, keep in mind, at this point, I only had two real cooking experiences on my resume. I had cooked in California that one summer, a couple of years before, and I had baked for a summer in South Carolina right after college. And everything else was me inflating my on-campus, catering experience to sound more impressive than it really was. And I started down in Tribeca. This was January 2003 or something like that. I think so. And started in Tribeca and walked all the way up to Danielle on 66th Street. So started at Balud, ended up at Danielle. And for anyone who's my age in their 40s and follows hot cuisine in Manhattan, you realize those are the bookends of two of the great restaurants in the city. And I dropped off 20 or 30 resumes that day. I got 3 callbacks. I did tryouts, and I got a job at Picholine, which is no longer open, but at the time was in that same echelon. Michelin hadn't come to New York yet, so we used Zagat ratings, and these were all like Zagat 28s and 29s. Michelin then came to New York and later gave Picholine a single star. But I can say that I cooked at a Michelin-starred restaurant. So I worked there for a while, just as a cook, just like cooking stuff. I wasn't the chef. I was just, a line cook, making food, putting it on plates. But it was the funnest time of my life, being, 20,
That's
young
so
in your
cool.
20s in New York City in the early aughts. This was when like food TV was becoming popular. So like chefs were treated like celebrities, even if you were just wearing a dirty apron. And I did that for a while and had the time of my life until I realized like I have no friends who aren't in the restaurant. I have no hobbies anymore. This is all I do.
Yeah.
And I was pretty good at it, and I probably could have kept doing it, but I missed the dilettantism. And so a friend of mine from our lab at Yale said, hey, I got a Smithsonian fellowship to go down to this island off the coast of Belize, and I need a field assistant. The only requirements are you have to be able to drive a boat, and have to know how to raise trichoplax. And I was like, I grew up driving boats, and I'm the only person in the world who knows how to raise trichoplax. So I quit the restaurant thing, went back to science, did field work with her for the summer, well, just a couple of weeks in the summer, and then ended up in grad school at Yale, back in the same lab group, roughly the same lab group I'd worked in. So it was
That's
like
so crazy.
yeah, not a straight line. It was very much a ping pong back and forth between these two worlds. But I felt like that was when I went to grad school, it's like, all right, I'm now walking through a door that I'm not going to walk back through. Like if I ever want to be a cook again, it's going to be at the end of my career as a,
Yeah.
it's like making a choice.
That's very
Um,
cool. And I
yeah.
think it's interesting because a lot of my friends growing up and all my childhood friends are in hospitality and food. A lot
Hmm.
of them cooked in Shea at Shea.
Right.
And that experience, and I guess maybe you have a rare experience of cooking on the West Coast and then the East Coast.
Hmm.
Um, which for those out there who may not be aware, very different styles
Yeah.
of kitchen. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that, like being cooking in the Bay Area and then cooking in New York, and
Absolutely.
what's the difference?
Yeah, and you'll have to correct me if this still exists because I'm dating myself. This was literally 20 years ago, right? 25, 20, almost
Yep.
25 years ago. Um, my experience on the West Coast was very much influenced by the Alice Waters School and the Jeremiah Towers and what became known as CalMed cuisine, which is a celebration of all the things that are grown locally and kind of raised to perfection. So it wouldn't be unusual to get a salad that was very much just the vegetables clean cut, prepared on your plate with a light something. It's like, look how amazing this lettuce is, right? Flash forward only through 2 years, and I'm in New York, and this is when like molecular gastronomy is starting to come in from
Yeah.
Spain, right? The El Bulli era. And it's like, look, we've deconstructed lettuce, and now you have little droplets of chlorophyll on your plate. It's the exact
Yeah.
opposite way of thinking. It's one of them is a celebration of food in kind of its wholest, purest form. The other is a celebration of food in terms of what we can do with it to kind of change our perceptions. And I mean, that's a very, very brief and maybe overly simplified difference, but I think that that probably still holds to a large extent,
Hmm.
right? It's kind of the whole foods versus the deconstructed movement. I mean, both coasts contain multitudes, and I don't want to sell anyone short. And I'm sure you can get great molecular gastronomy on the West Coast and amazing farm to table on the East Coast. Certainly, you have chefs like Dan Barber in New York who've taken farm to table to absurd ends, building his restaurant in his farm, right,
Yeah.
and so forth. But that was my experience, and
Yep.
I'll say in my home kitchen, like just like your favorite music today is still probably what you grew up on in high school, like that Beowulf experience, learning how to do really whole food preparations and celebrating the splendor of the natural product is still my preference, right?
Yep.
That's still kind of how
Absolutely.
I like to cook and eat. But
Yep. That's I think it's still very similar to that style
mhm.
on like in terms of like coastal cuisine and coastal like just styles. And I think I was like trying to think about it, like why is that the case? And I guess I was like we're like in the Bay Area, you're kind of like blessed with like we're super lucky to have that
Yeah.
level of produce, but it's
Hmm.
like harder to come by in the Northeast. So you kind of have to like really refine the technique
Hmm.
to make your ingredient just
Yeah.
like taste amazing. And I've always thought about, I was like, if you just like marry those two, where you have like the pantry of like the West
Hmm.
Coast, kind of like San Joaquin Valley, and then the
Hmm.
technique of like the Northeast, you just like get incredible
Sure, and
combination.
and then you have chefs like Thomas Keller who set up outposts on both coasts and really showed what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
But no, it was a super fun education, and a lot of people point immediately to like, oh well, cooking is such a science, like that makes sense that the science could, and I buy that to a very large extent. I think that what appeals to me about working at the lab bench, because I was always a lab scientist, and in the kitchen, there are a lot of overlaps, especially in my utter disregard for recipes and my desire to just kind of throw DNA in a tube and see what happens.
Yeah.
But I also like to keep those two things separate, right? Like
Yep.
I decided not to try to marry the pursuits, but I may ping pong back and forth. Now, you had asked me about the Friday Harbor experience, and I wanted to
Yep.
circle back to that because this is actually where the story was heading. Um, so I'm, 2024 I'm sorry, 2004, I enter Yale's biomedical program. And now I actually come in through the biomedical program, not through evolution and ecology for various reasons. Um, Part of which is my old boss in evolutionary biology had a health issue and was not taking students. So I joined his collaborators lab in the molecular genetics department, or the molecular development department. But the other thing is I wanted to learn harder science. Like I wanted to go more mechanistic, right? I knew that. Um, but I also couldn't shake the marine biology stuff, right? So I got this fellowship at Friday Harbor to go do an invertebrate embryology class for the 6 weeks. It's basically like it's like the movie with band camp. Once at band camp, it really
Yeah.
is. We are such geeks. We are such biology geeks and microscopy geeks, and just loving it and completely unashamed about it. And it was such a wonderful group of students, many of whom went on to have good faculty positions and successful academic careers. But we just spent the summer staring down the barrels of a microscope, watching, throwback to my uncle, sea urchins develop and drawing, pencil and paper, drawing what we saw down the microscope. And again, this is kind of this lost art of, if you draw something, you have to pay attention to it. You have to make choices about what's important. And, if you take a high resolution microscopy image, you're going to get all the details, but it's a different exercise. It's a different exercise to learn it. So that was an amazing summer. But shortly after I had gotten accepted to that program and gotten a fellowship to pay for it, I got a job offer out of the blue in my inbox one morning from the captain of a large private motor yacht that was owned by the family of a college friend of mine, inviting me to come cook aboard the motor yacht for the summer season in the Mediterranean. And so I was faced with this door A, door B of, do I go out to Friday Harbor and do my science, geek camp, my embryology, or do I break my promise to myself and my advisor and everyone else and take a summer out of science right after I got started and go cook again? And I was just thinking about, it's like, if I go on a yacht in the Mediterranean to cook for the summer, I am never coming back, am I?
Yeah.
I had also, when I was applying to grad schools, I got into University of Hawaii, and I loved the program and I loved the faculty I was going to go work with there. But it was the same thing. His lab looked at Waikiki. I was never going to actually finish my PhD if I went to study there. And so it was the hardest career decision I've ever made, was not starting this company. It was turning down a job offer to quit grad school and go cook again on a boat. But I didn't. I did Friday Harbor. It was an amazing experience. I got to eat a lot of oysters, and then I carried it. Went back to my lab at Yale, and 4 or 5 years later, ended up with a PhD. So,
thanks for joining us on this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast, featuring Rafael Rosengarten. Be sure to tune in for part 2, as Rafael takes us through his time at Yale and postdoctoral work at the Joint Bioenergy Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.